Father, as we come to look at these words from long ago, these words from Exodus, Lord, we pray that you would speak to us this evening. We pray that you'd be with us now. You would open our hearts and our ears to all that you have in store for us, Father. We pray that you'd be among us now. Amen. Do you have those words open in front of you? Over the last few years, we've seen the way in which the world and individual countries have responded to a lot of different issues that have come up. We've been part of a world that has been faced with a global pandemic. We're currently part of a world that is faced with another great war. And as countries, we can see the way that America in the past have dealt with accusations of stolen elections, issues of gun crime, constitutional questioning, while we're here in the UK are faced with governments that have been changing leadership, with uncertainty on what might come next. And how do we respond to these things? During COVID, most people seemed to work out how to pull together. Many stayed in their homes on a whole and tried to keep others safe. Some rejected the idea, continued to fight against anything the government said. In the face of the war that rages on, we see a range of responses. Some opening their homes to those who have been met by great trouble. Churches in surrounding countries reaching out, finding ways to reach into the country and help them in their trouble. Even governments have ranged, haven't they? Some offering full-fledged support to Ukraine, some making promises that have yet to be fulfilled. And we see huge responses to issues in government, haven't we? It seems that most people are either one side of the fence or another, but they all seem to agree over the past few months that changes need to be made. The world responds in a range of different ways to the different issues that we're faced day to day. Sometimes people respond with great emotional responses to what they see before them, while others sometimes respond quietly, not wanting to be seen as too aggressive. When it comes to the good news about Jesus and the sharing of God's will, there also comes huge responses from people. And it's not something that has just begun recently. It's something that has been happening throughout the history of the world. And as we look at these words of chapter 5 together, we see how the world responds to God. And that's what we're going to be thinking about this evening as we explore these words of Pharaoh and the issues that come up. Probably one of the loudest groups that we hear in the world when it comes to opposing God are those who believe that science has an answer for everything. That there's no need for God and science can take him out of the question. Be it with discussions about evolution, the Big Bang Theory, or the way the universe continues to show itself in all its awe. Recently, I was shown an article about the issues that science were facing at this moment, as they come to terms with the fact that the Darwin's theory of evolution simply doesn't stack up with the questions that are being asked of it. Questions about where the first cells evolved from. Scientists are noting that the theory seems to skip past some basic levels of evolution to begin its work. But we don't just see that in science. The world responds to the universe. They look at the universe and they think, well, we know in their mind how it's worked, but can't answer the questions that are thrown up when the James Webb Space Telescope begins to see even more amazing things out there. These images that come from those telescopes are amazing images of God's great work. But rather than think about that, they try and work out how it fits into their narrative of a universe that sits in their mind at 13 billion years old, with very little factual evidence for the case. The world responds to the news of God, to his creation of the world, in ways that look to take him out of the picture. They always have, and we see that in this passage. Even as Pharaoh responds to God, well, we see him trying to take God out of the picture. So as we begin, we see the first way in which the world responds in verses 1 to 5. And that is that they dishonor him. There was a man once called Edwin Thomas. His full name was Edwin Thomas Booth. At age 15, he debuted on the stage playing Trestle of his father's Richard III. And within a few short years, he played the lead in the show. Not just that, but he played many leads. He was the big stage show actor of his time. And he had a younger brother named John, who was an actor as well. He couldn't compare to his brother, but he did give memorable performances. He gave one of the most memorable in 1863, a production of Julius Caesar. But 2 years later, well, he was known for something much different, as he jumped from the box of a bloodied President Lincoln at the stage of the Ford Theatre. And that was John Wilkes Booth. And that stigma that grew into his name, well, it overshadowed everything that Edwin had done. An invisible asterisk was now next to his name. No one wanted Edwin anymore, because all they could think of was his brother. He had been dishonored by John. People rejected him. They turned their backs on him because of John. And as we look at these words of Pharaoh today, as we explore his response to Moses and Aaron, we see Pharaoh dishonoring the Lord, rejecting him, wanting nothing to do with him, attributing everything that was happening and would happen to acts of coincidence. People in the world, they take the glory of God and they dishonor him by passing them off as something else. Having spent time with the people of Israel, we open this chapter with Moses and Aaron continuing on in God's great plan, going before Pharaoh. This taking great courage for them as they're going to stand before the all-powerful Pharaoh in human terms. It wasn't like anything they would have experienced before. When we look at our public figures, we see people who are meant to be just like us. We're meant to be able to pass them in the street and barely notice them. In the summer, I was in London at a conference, and as I was walking around Westminster, I passed by Labour's leader, Keir Starmer, only to realise, after a couple of looks back, that was who it was. And the same thing actually happened a few months later at a service station halfway up the country. But when it comes to Pharaoh, it's a very different tale. Pharaoh was not like a public servant in our country. He wasn't like someone you might pass by and then suddenly realize as you look back. Everyone knew who he was. No one could have missed him and had to do a double take. His power and authority were supreme. There was no constitution or law or legislative higher or even remotely equal to him. The pharaohs were said to be children of the sun, friends of the great gods of Egypt. And they sat with them in their own temples to receive worship alongside them. This was how great this power was that Moses and Aaron were going before. An inscription by a pharaoh on an ancient Egyptian temple gives the idea. He says, "I am that which was and is and shall be." and no man has lifted my veil." They were seen as gods among men in this time, and that is who Moses and Pharaoh go to stand before now, with the words of the true God, the only God. "Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Moses is filled with the confidence of the Lord here. He knows God is with both him and Aaron, and he makes his request for freedom for the Israelites, making a bold statement as well. He's not asking for Pharaoh's slaves to be let go. He's asking for God's people to be let go, belonging to God. Pharaoh hears this, and his response is to reject and dishonor the Lord in his words. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." Pharaoh knew of many gods, but the true Lord was not one of them that he accepted. He didn't accept the Lord's ownership of Israel, and so he refuses this request. And it's a dangerous situation that he finds himself in here, claiming ignorance of the Lord. People can't really claim this in this day and age, though, can they? They might try and say they don't know of him, but people hear of him at Easter, Christmas. People know about him from Bible stories that they look at in RE. At times they hear about him, hopefully from friends who are Christians. People can't make this claim now. And Pharaoh would have been in a very similar situation. He would have known the history of his people. He would have known the way that Joseph came into the land. He would have known of all the history books that came before him that said of how this God saved the Egyptians during 7 years of famine. But he claims ignorance. He dishonors the Lord by pretending none of that had ever happened. But Moses relays the demands God first gave him back in Exodus chapter 3, verse 18. When he says, "Let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to the Lord our God." God presents a smaller request here to Pharaoh. He makes the request a bit more appealing to him, easy for him to accept. Let us only go for 3 days' journey in and then 3 days back. He did it so that Pharaoh would have no excuse for refusing the Lord. And in that his heart was hardened. It's not a big request. It's a simple time to worship their God and then to seemingly return. They even point out the risks of not being allowed to go and do this, don't they? The pestilence, the sword. Here it seems as though Moses speaks of judgment on Israel. But also in these moments we see a foreshadowing of what will fall on Egypt later. But the king of Egypt has little interest. Pharaoh cares little for honoring the Lord, for allowing the people to go and worship the Lord. He rejects all of these requests and dishonors God further. Not only does he question who this God is, but he says, "Because you've asked, I'm going to punish the people. I'm going to make their life harder." I wonder how we see this in the world today. In some ways, we see it in the devaluing of the Sabbath day. Shops open longer and longer, people being made to work and negatively impacted if they ask for a Sunday off. We see it in the limitations of sharing one's faith with people in the workplace. The Lord provided working days, provided a day of rest that should be used to honor the Lord, but the world seems to care more about financial gain and dishonors the Lord. And this issue isn't just about Sundays specifically, but rather about the subtraction of time to honor the Lord in favor of gaining things in the world. It's the idolizing of worldly things in the place of the Lord when we see these issues in the world. God speaks through Moses and Aaron here. Yet Pharaoh doesn't heed the godly voice. Rather, he cares about the things that he is losing, even if it's just for a short time. He cares more about himself than listening to any of these words. And the world is very similar to Pharaoh in the way it works. We look to share the good news with them, to bring them in to see his glory, but they instead focus on what they feel like they'll miss out on. God gives us rules, gives us ways of living that will honor him, yet the world sees them as limitations, see them as things that are there to cause us trouble, and so they reject them. They reject good ways of living and look rather to live out selfish ambitions that seek to honor themselves and the world as a whole rather than God. God created all things. He is to be honored for that, yet the world would much rather honor a theoretical Big Bang explosion or a theoretical evolutionary process that is being scrutinized even by scientists in the world now. But we must be different. We must stand apart from the world. We must honor him. But that's not all the world does. As we continue into verses 6 through to 18, we also see that in response to the world, they oppress his people. They oppress his people. As you study the book of Exodus, as you look into all that is happening in this book, you see the way that the ancient world stood against God, especially with the attitude of the Egyptians in these days and the days that are still to come with the other enemies of the Lord. But that oppression, that opposition to God's people continues. A Guardian report wrote on Christian persecution at the start of 2021, in light of the COVID crisis, noted persecution of Christians around the world has increased during the pandemic, with followers being refused aid in many countries, authoritarian governments stepping up surveillance, and Islamic militants exploiting the crisis. A report said more than 340 million Christians, 1 in 8, face high levels of persecution and discrimination because of their faith. When the world finds people who stand for God, well, their response is ever-growingly negative and has been moving closer and closer to oppression each year. Pharaoh has been faced with the God of the Israelites for seemingly the first time in these moments. And his immediate response is to oppress the people, to increase the quota that is on them. He almost doubles their work in these next few words, demanding that they not only make the same amount of bricks as before, but now that they collect all the straw as well. Maybe he thought if they were too busy doing all of this work, then freedom would be the furthest thought from their mind. Pharaoh rejects God even in the words that he speaks. In verse 8 and on, where he calls for them to lay on them the quota of bricks which they were making before, not to reduce it, saying they are idle, asking to go and sacrifice to their God. Moses' call for freedom to worship the Lord was rejected wholeheartedly by Pharaoh, who seems to claim that they only want to do it so they can go and party or go and have that festival, some time off maybe from their work. In Pharaoh's mind, he is God. And he will give no time to worship something else. And so he oppresses them further, doubling their work, yet holding fast to his expectations. Sometimes we can force ourselves to get on with work a bit harder. And in times we can learn to add extra things into our lives, but there are some things, especially time-sensitive things, that can't be squeezed in. These bricks, they needed time to bake in the sun. They needed to be ready at set times. And in the past, when the straw was being given, they could do it. They could follow through with the request. They had the vital ingredients. But now, this would make it nearly impossible for them. Pharaoh knows this as well. He knows what he's doing. He knows he's oppressing them further. He knows that he wants to stop them thinking about God. He wants to make their life too hard for them to bear. And we hear that in verse 9, don't we? Let more work be laid on the men, that they may labor in it, and let them not regard these false words. No, don't let them hear what Moses and Aaron are saying. The king of Egypt appears to believe the adage, idle bodies make for active minds. So he increases their workload. He wants them to not listen to these words of a God above them. The lies, or literally words of defeat, the deceit of which he speaks, apparently refer to the words of deliverance and redemption that Moses and Aaron speak to the people. He spoke to them in chapter 4, verses 29 to 31, of this freedom. And Pharaoh looks to stamp it out. Pharaoh proclaims that Moses and Aaron are false prophets, promising a salvation that cannot be delivered. So the oppression is there to make them ignore the words of the Lord. Now in verses 6 to 9, we see some of the sort of staff meetings. We see a conversation that feels that way. And now as we move on to verse 10, we see the words and therefore the oppression begin over these people. The taskmasters going out to the officers, questioning them on what's being done, telling them how to continue to make the work harder. What had the promise been that they had heard of? Well, they had been promised by Moses and Aaron a freedom, salvation, going to a land where they could worship the Lord. Before that, they had been promised a land of their forefathers. But what had they received? They had received harsh treatment in these words. Accusations of laziness, further oppression. This looks similar to the world and the way that they respond to the people of God. When you become a Christian, you're told that there will be a great benefit of following the Lord. You'll be free from the shackles of sin, be united with Christ, will have eternal life. But sadly, as you walk through the world, things aren't going to be easy. Things will be hard. People will reject you. People will make life difficult for you. But you still should trust those promises, because God's promises are true. And God will work out his promises in time. The promise of freedom for them will come. But they will have to endure a hardship just as we do. And as we continue, as we read into verses 12 and 13, we see the oppression that they face. The slave drivers working them harder. Failure to follow through with this, simply leading to more and more punishment. And not only were the workers punished for these things, but those who had been put over them. The Israelites who had been given leadership roles are beaten for failing to hit their quota. It's complete degradation, demeaning the whole people publicly, oppressing God's people to make them forget. In their trouble, the children of Israel don't turn to God, sadly, in verse 15. Where do they go? They go to Pharaoh. They cry out to him, saying, "Why are you dealing with us in this way?" They felt that their previous bondage was better than their current increased misery, so they go to them, and in their oppression, they seem to have fallen into his trap. And what we'll see is Pharaoh look to weaponize this oppression, to attempt to turn them from the Lord in these hardships by shifting the blame. Because Pharaoh cares little for their struggles. He sees them as lazy good-for-nothings, who would only be cured of their laziness through more hard work. He begins to point to Moses, doesn't he, in verse 17? You are idle, idle, therefore you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Points to those words that Moses brought to him earlier. They came to him with a request to praise the Lord and were met with an attack. And we can face that as we try and share the good news out in the world, can't we? As we go and tell people of the good news of Christ, we can often be met with the attacks of those who reject it. Moses came with simple request. Let us go and worship the Lord. Let us sacrifice to our God in the desert and seemingly return to the work after we have done them. But in response to this, Pharaoh's anger is shown. And he focuses on enslaving the people even more. He wants to oppress them further. He hopes that this oppression will break their hope. He hopes that it will turn them from their God, that they'll have nowhere else to look but him. The oppression that we face in the world, it's not the same as this, but it's still apparent. It still hopes to break our trust in the Lord. Rather than facing physical oppression, we face intellectual oppression. Scientists claim to have all the answers, which we see more and more that they don't. Humanists and atheists claim that to believe in God is old-fashioned, out of date. But when faced with any kind of discussion on faith, rather than being open to that discourse, look to attack you. In their own ways, they hope to oppress the people into ignoring their belief system, hoping that they can attack them out of believing in God. But in that oppression, we must continue to look to the Lord. Not look to the things in the world around us, but rather focus on our need of him. Turn to him when we feel oppressed. Trust in him that his promises will come through. Ask him to strengthen us. For the final thing that the world does when faced with the Lord, well, that is seen in our final few verses. They attempt to sow division. They attempt to sow division. An issue of National Geographic included a photograph of fossilized remains of two saber-toothed cats locked in combat. To quote the article, one had bitten deep into the leg bone of the other and trapped them both in a common fate. The cause of death of the two cats is as clear as the cause of the extinction of their species. But when Christians fight each other, well, everybody loses. As Paul put it, if you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. Division is something that brings about great trouble for people in life, and especially for the church, if it's allowed to seep in. When we begin to turn on each other in the church, we find we give others an easier route to attack us. We cause ourselves to take our eyes off the Lord and bring ourselves into that state of disunity. These people, they had heard the good news that the Lord had a plan for them, that the Lord would take them from this land and save them. But Pharaoh had been able to cause division between them. causing a harsh oppression on the people, and then saying, well, Moses has done this to you. Because if he can cause division, by his mind he wins. In verse 19, we see the officers of the children of Israel saw that they were in trouble. After it was said, you shall not reduce any bricks from your daily quota. Having come and asked about the situation, they understand what has happened. They know the danger that they now face, and they're fearful of what else might be to come. The Hebrew word in here, however, can have that spatial sense of among or before or in the midst of. Perhaps the Hebrew foreman realized that they were right in the middle of trouble in this moment. That they were in the work of the evil one in this moment as he continues to try and oppress them. They saw that this was just the beginning. And their response, and through their response, we see Pharaoh's work coming to a fruition, don't we? Because as they leave Pharaoh's presence, they come to meet Moses and Aaron. And we see the issues that arise there. The danger before them has understandably displeased them. They didn't want further oppression. They don't want to feel the hardship of all that Pharaoh is doing to them. And we can see that it also seems to come at a time that causes them to forget God's promises. And now all they feel is anger, frustration at Moses and Aaron. We see that in verse 21, don't we? Let the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hands to kill us. The officers of Israel were certain that God was on their side. Anything that made the immediate condition of the Israelites worse was not of God in their minds. They found themselves standing opposed to the true messenger of God. They looked at their situation, then they felt they knew what God would want, how God would work, and what he would do, and they turned on God's chosen one. During World War II, Hitler commanded all religious groups to unite so he could control them. And among the Brethren assemblies, half complied and half refused. Those who went along with the order, they had a much easier time. Those who didn't faced persecution. In almost every family of those who resisted, someone died in a concentration camp. And when the war was over, feelings of bitterness ran deep between these groups. And there was much tension. Finally, they decided that the situation had to be healed. Leaders from each group met at a quiet retreat. And for several days, each person spent time in prayer, examining their own hearts in the light of Christ's commands. Then they came together. Francis Schaeffer, who told of the incident, asked a friend who was there, "What did you do then?" "We were just one," he replied. They confessed their hostility and bitterness to God. They yielded to his control. The Holy Spirit created a unity among them. Love filled their hearts and dissolved their hatred. Because when love prevails among believers, especially in times of strong disagreement, it presents to the world an indisputable mark of a true follower of Christ. Whether the arguments are for reasons that seem right or wrong, division between believers only leads to damage the church. The churches that complied with the Nazi commands should have stood firm for the Lord, but as the churches came back together in the aftermath of the war, unity should have been strived for. Discussions should have been had. Pharaoh dangles this punishment in front of the people, knowing that it will cause disunity, knowing that Moses and Aaron will be turned on. And as we see in these words, it begins to happen, and it leads to danger for God's people. They believe this was the wrong Moses did. That he made them obnoxious, abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh. When Israel was an obedient slave to Pharaoh, they thought he was their friend. And now this idea of freedom has entered the picture. Pharaoh shows how he really felt about them all along. Satan sometimes, he seems friendly to us when we accept his lordship. But when we start to see freedom in Christ, he'll often make things difficult for us. Now God allowed all this. In fact, you could say that he designed it. In theory, God could have freed Israel from Egypt without a struggle on their part. Yet he knew that it wasn't good for them. It wasn't the best thing for them. That for them to make the transition from slave to free, to people of the promised land, testing and stretching was absolutely necessary in these moments. Now the world, it attempts to cause disunity in the church. Look at the push that they call progressive moves. Push on LGBT issues, belittling family units, limiting parents' input into school life. More recently, we've seen in the media this push for gender-neutral words for God. If they can convince some of the church that these things are okay, well, it will cause splinters in the church. It makes the church an easier target if the world can break in. But we must stand strong. We must find unity in the Lord. What we see in these events is the way that issues that the people are facing at the time regarding Pharaoh and the issues that we still face today. When faced with the Lord coming to save his people, Pharaoh's response is to make life hard. If you could do that, maybe they turn from their God and trust him alone. After all this, Pharaoh believed himself to be a god, didn't he? And if he was indeed one, then the people should fear him, and they shouldn't be looking anywhere else. If he could dishonor God freely, oppress the people harshly, spread division among their number, he would weaken them so much that they would just fall in line. But what does this passage tell us then? Well, it gives us a clear view of what the world does when we fall under God. When we speak of his way of living. When we look to share his ideas for the world. They dishonor him through the mockery they put on television, through the science that is pushed on unfounded theories that hope to remove God from the picture. They oppress the people by limiting what Christians can do, who we can talk to, what we can say. If they can do that, they hope they can stop the spread of the good news. And finally, they look to spread disunity. They hope to have the church be full of people who are in fact just worldly. If they can do that, well, then the church will crumble. If they can make the church more of a social club, then they think they can remove the power of God from the world. So we must stand firm. We must steer clear of the danger of allowing the world a foothold in our lives. For the good news of the cross is offensive to the world. And they will do all they can to stop it. So cling to the Lord. Trust in him in the face of all that we come up against.